Welcome to the darker side of medieval life. Today we journey into 10 horrifying practices women were subjected to in those turbulent times. From brutal punishments to twisted superstitions, each tale reveals a chilling truth. Let's step into the shadows of history. We begin our descent into the shadows of the past with one of history's most terrifying chapters, the Great European Witch Hunts. This was an age steeped in fear, a time when the veil between the natural and supernatural worlds was perilously thin. The Black Death had left deep scars upon the collective psyche, and the tremors of the Reformation fractured the bedrock of faith. In a world beset by famine, plague, and war, where life was fragile and unpredictable, misfortune was rarely seen as mere chance. Instead, it was perceived as an act of malice, a deliberate evil unleashed upon the world. And for this evil, a scapegoat was needed. The figure of the witch, a servant of Satan walking among the righteous, became the vessel for all of society's anxieties. It was a belief system that turned suspicion into a weapon and transformed ordinary women into monsters in the eyes of their neighbors, their judges, and sometimes even themselves. The path to the pyre often began not with a demonic pact, but with a simple human failing, a curdled pot of milk, a stillborn calf, a lingering illness. It could start with a neighbor's envy over a small plot of land, a rejected romantic advance, or the simmering resentment of a village outcast. The accusation was a poison whispered on the wind. Women were disproportionately the targets, seen by the era's theologians and scholars as morally weaker, more impressionable, and thus more susceptible to the devil's temptations. A woman who was old, poor, and lived alone was particularly vulnerable. A midwife, whose work placed her at the threshold of life and death, could be blamed for a difficult birth or an infant's demise. A healer, skilled in the use of herbs, could see her knowledge twisted into evidence of diabolical craft. Once the word witch was uttered, it clung to a woman like a shroud, and the machinery of persecution, grinding and inexorable, began to turn. Fueling this hysteria was a terrifyingly influential text, the Hammer of Witches. Published in 1487 by the Catholic clergyman Heinrich Kramer, this book was a comprehensive misogynistic treatise on the identification, prosecution, and extermination of witches. It was, in essence, a manual for murder, lending the weight of theological and legal authority to the persecution. They argued that witchcraft was not only real, but was primarily a female crime. It provided inquisitors with a framework outlining how to interpret any sign as proof of guilt. The investigation would begin. The accused woman would be stripped and publicly searched for a devil's mark. Any mole, birthmark, or skin tag was deemed a spot where the devil had branded his servant, or where a demonic familiar had suckled. Professional witch prickers were employed, armed with long needles to poke these marks. According to the twisted logic of the hunt, if the spot did not bleed, or if the woman felt no pain, perhaps due to shock or the simple fact that the pricker was using a retractable blade, it was considered irrefutable proof of her guilt. With evidence secured, the next stage was to extract a confession. In the eyes of the law, witchcraft was an exceptional crime so heinous that normal legal procedures, including the prohibition of torture, were suspended. The accused was cast into a lightless, freezing dungeon, a place designed to break the body and the spirit. Here she faced an array of instruments engineered for agony. The thumbscrews that would crush her fingers, the strappado that would dislocate her shoulders, the leg vices known as the Spanish boot that would splinter her shins. Sleep deprivation was a common and brutally effective technique, with guards keeping the victim awake for days on end until delirium and despair set in. The goal was not to discover the truth, but to manufacture it. The confession had to be complete. The inquisitors demanded not only an admission of guilt, but also a detailed account of her pact with the devil, her attendance at the witches' Sabbath, and most crucially, the names of other witches in her coven. Under unbearable pain, many women confessed to impossible crimes implicating friends and neighbors, thus perpetuating the cycle of accusation, torture, and death. In some regions, guilt or innocence was determined by a trial by ordeal, a supposed appeal to God's judgment. The most infamous of these was the swimming test, or trial by water. This is where the horrifying logic of the ducking stool, a device often used for public humiliation, was twisted into a mortal test. The accused woman's right thumb would be bound to her left big toe and her left thumb to her right big toe, contorting her body. She was then thrown into a river or lake. The theory was that water, a pure element used in baptism, would reject a servant of the devil. If she floated, she was a witch and was promptly pulled from the water to be executed, usually by fire. If she sank, she was deemed innocent in the eyes of God. But this divine acquittal was often a death sentence in itself, as many drowned before they could be pulled from the depths. It was a perfect, inescapable trap, a spectacle of cruelty disguised as a sacred rite, where the only path to innocence lay through the gates of death. For those who confessed under torture or were found guilty by ordeal, the final act was a public spectacle of horrifying retribution. The sentence was almost invariably death by burning. The pyre was a potent symbol. Fire was believed to be a purifying element capable of cleansing the soul of the witch and the community of her taint. The execution was a meticulously staged event, a piece of civic and religious theatre. A procession would lead the condemned through the streets, a sermon would be preached, and the crowd would gather to watch. This was not a hidden act of shame, but a public warning, a brutal demonstration of the power of both church and state. The flames that consumed the victim were meant to sear a lesson into the minds of all who watched. This is the fate of those who stray from God and community. The witch hunts left a legacy of ashes and trauma. It is estimated that tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 50,000 people, the vast majority of them women, were executed. Entire communities were torn apart by paranoia and betrayal. The witch trials stand as a chilling monument to the horrors that can be unleashed when fear, misogyny, and absolute belief are allowed to override reason, empathy, and justice. In the shadowed corners of history, where progress casts a long and often forgetful shadow, lie instruments of exquisite cruelty. They were not designed for the battlefield, nor for the cells of common criminals. They were crafted for the home, for the village square, for the woman who dared to possess a voice. This is the scold's bridle, sometimes known as the brank. It is a vicious iron mask, a cage for the head, but its true purpose was to imprison something far more intangible, a woman's opinion. Its design was diabolical in its simplicity. A locking iron framework was placed over the head, but the true horror lay within. A metal gag or bit, often studded with a spike, was forced into the mouth and pressed brutally down upon the tongue. This mechanism made speech impossible, but its cruelty went far beyond mere silencing. Every attempt to move the tongue, to swallow, or even to breathe deeply would result in agonizing lacerations. The victim was forced into a state of constant, excruciating pain, a living monument to the consequences of speaking out of turn. The so-called crime that warranted such torture was as vague as it was pervasive. A scold was not just a woman who argued. She could be a gossip, a woman who challenged her husband's authority, one who engaged in political or religious debate, or simply one who was deemed too loud, too witty, or too disruptive to the rigid patriarchal order. In a world where female submission was equated with piety and social stability, an outspoken woman was not merely an annoyance. She was a threat, a crack in the very foundation of their society. But the punishment did not end with the physical torment. The true goal was utter and complete humiliation. Victims were often paraded through town, sometimes led by a chain held by a church official or their own husband. This spectacle of shame was a calculated act of psychological warfare. It was a message not just to the woman in the mask, but to every woman who watched. Every jeer from the crowd, every piece of filth thrown was a reinforcement of the brutal social code. Her identity was erased, replaced by the singular shameful label of scold. Her dignity was systematically stripped away, leaving behind a shell of a person, forever marked by the community's judgment. This public degradation was part of a wider arsenal of shame-based punishments. The ducking stool or cucking stool was another favorite. A woman would be strapped to a chair at the end of a long wooden beam and repeatedly plunged into the local river or pond. The shock of the cold water, the terror of drowning, the public spectacle, it was all part of the design. While ostensibly a punishment for disorderly behavior, it often served as a precursor to more serious accusations. A woman who floated was sometimes suspected of witchcraft, while one who drowned was, tragically, considered innocent. It was a trial with no good outcome, a brutal expression of a society's deep-seated fear and mistrust of female power. The psychological scars from such an ordeal were profound and permanent. A survivor would be a social pariah, her reputation in tatters, her spirit broken. The memory of the cold water, the suffocating mask, and the hateful eyes of her neighbors would haunt her for the rest of her days. While public punishment was a tool for controlling a woman's voice, the institution of marriage was the primary instrument for controlling her entire life. For the vast majority of women in this era, marriage was seldom a matter of love, and almost never a choice. It was a cold, calculated transaction between families, a strategic alliance forged in property and power. Women were the currency in these transactions, their value assessed not by their character or intellect, but by the assets they brought with them. Families demanded crippling dowries, land, livestock, money, and political connections that would determine a daughter's marital prospects. A wealthy dowry could secure a powerful husband, elevating the entire family's status. A poor dowry could mean a life of servitude to a lesser man, or worse, no marriage at all, leaving the woman as a financial burden on her family. She was a pawn in a game played by men, her future decided in rooms she was not permitted to enter. Upon marriage, a woman ceased to exist as a legal entity under the doctrine of coverture. Her rights, her property, and her very identity were subsumed or covered by her husband. She could not own land, enter into contracts, sue or be sued. Any wages she earned belonged to him. Even the children she bore were legally his property. She transitioned from being her father's property to her husband's, her life a continuous state of ownership. The church, while technically requiring consent for a valid marriage, did little to challenge the overwhelming social and familial pressure. What was a young girl to do when faced with the combined will of her father, her community, and her God? Refusal was an act of rebellion so profound it was almost unthinkable. To say no was to defy the natural order, to invite catastrophe upon oneself and one's family. The consequences were swift and severe. A defiant daughter could face constant harassment and emotional abuse from her own kin. She might be beaten into submission. She could be disowned, cast out with no means of survival in a world where an unattached woman was vulnerable to the worst kinds of exploitation. For some, the alternative to an unwanted marriage was the convent, a life sentence of another kind, trading a domestic prison for a spiritual one. For others, refusal could lead to accusations of witchcraft or heresy, as such defiance was seen as unnatural, possibly demonic. Their lives were never truly their own. From the words they were forbidden to speak, to the husbands they were forced to accept, to the children they were compelled to bear, every aspect of their existence was dictated by a system designed to control and contain them. They were instruments of lineage, vessels for heirs, and when they dared to object, subjects of silence and shame. In the shadowed corridors of medieval history, where science was entangled with superstition, the practice of medicine was often a greater terror than the ailment itself. For women, this landscape was uniquely perilous, a place where their bodies were viewed as battlegrounds for unseen forces and their suffering was systematically misunderstood. The era's most celebrated medical theory, the doctrine of the four humours, posited that health depended on the delicate balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. An imbalance of any of these vital fluids was thought to cause disease, and the prescribed solution was almost always as brutal as it was simple: removal. This led to the widespread and terrifying practice of bloodletting. Believed to be a panacea for everything from a simple fever to raging madness, it was applied with a chilling lack of precision. Physicians, often more akin to butchers than healers, would use unsterilized lancets to open a vein or apply leeches to suck the excess blood away. The amount to be drained was determined not by careful measure but by the patient's perceived constitution or the alignment of the stars. For women, this procedure was prescribed with alarming frequency. Any sign of emotional distress, anxiety, or what was vaguely termed melancholy could be diagnosed as an excess of black bile requiring immediate bleeding. Menstrual irregularities or complications in pregnancy were, of course, seen as clear signs of a humoral imbalance. The result was often catastrophic. Instead of a cure, the patient was plunged into anemia, shock, and infection from the unclean instruments. Countless women, already weakened by illness or childbirth, were pushed into the grave by the very treatment meant to save them. The physician, seeing the patient weaken and fade, would often conclude not that the treatment was flawed, but that the disease was simply too powerful, or worse, that the patient's constitution was inherently weak and female. Beyond this direct harm was the pervasive dismissal of women's health entirely. The very concept of gynecology was shrouded in ignorance and religious dogma. The female body was a mystery, its workings attributed to divine will or demonic influence rather than biology. The most infamous diagnosis was that of hysteria, a term derived from the Greek word for uterus, hystera. It was believed that the womb was a free-floating organ, an animal within an animal that could wander throughout a woman's body, causing a bewildering array of symptoms: shortness of breath, fainting spells, paralysis, and emotional outbursts. The prescribed cures were as bizarre as the diagnosis. They ranged from placing foul-smelling substances near the woman's nose to lure the womb back down, to physically manipulating the abdomen. These invasive and humiliating procedures were rooted in a deep-seated belief that a woman's health, mind and soul were intrinsically linked to her reproductive organs, and that any deviation from quiet subservience was a medical problem to be solved, often by force. Yet in the heart of these communities, far from the universities and the male-dominated medical guilds, there existed another tradition of healing. For centuries, women were the keepers of folk medicine. They were the herbalists, the healers, the midwives. Their knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter, was a rich tapestry of practical wisdom. They knew which plants could soothe a fever, which poultices could draw out infection, and which teas could ease the pains of childbirth. They were the first responders in a world without hospitals, offering comfort and care when formal medicine had nothing but theory and cold steel. But this position of respect was precarious. As the Church's power grew and society became more rigid, this traditional knowledge began to be viewed with suspicion. A woman who could heal was also a woman who could potentially harm. The line between a healing salve and a witch's brew became dangerously, fatally thin. When the Black Death swept across Europe, decimating the population, fear reached a fever pitch. The plague was an invisible, unstoppable enemy, and in their terror people demanded a visible one. They needed someone to blame, and who better than the woman on the edge of the village, the one who lived alone, who spoke to her plants, whose remedies sometimes failed in the face of an apocalyptic pestilence. The logic of fear is swift and merciless. If a healer's patient died, she had not failed, she had murdered. If a midwife oversaw a birth that ended in tragedy, she had not been unlucky, she had cursed the child. If she herself survived the plague while others perished, she had not been fortunate. She had made a pact with the devil for her own protection. Whispers in taverns and fearful glances in the market square would curdle into formal accusations. Women, especially those who were old, poor, widowed, or simply unconventional, were condemned without evidence. In these fearful times, a woman's knowledge became her noose and her compassion the proof of her guilt. She was no longer a healer, she was a scapegoat, a vessel for the collective terror of a world turned upside down. For women accused of lesser crimes, crimes against the social order rather than God, the punishment was not always death, but a kind of social execution. Public humiliation was a powerful tool for enforcing conformity, and its instruments were fixtures of the medieval town square. The stocks, which locked the ankles, and the pillory, which secured the head and hands, were not merely instruments of restraint. They were stages for ritualized degradation. A woman could find herself sentenced to this fate for offenses deemed uniquely female, for being a scold, that is, for speaking her mind too freely, or arguing with her husband, for gossiping, for adultery, for any behavior that challenged the patriarchal order. The punishment was a spectacle. The victim was placed in the most public space possible, exposed for hours, sometimes days, to the elements. But the weather was the least of her worries. The true punishment was delivered by the crowd. It was a civic duty and a form of entertainment to mock and abuse the condemned. They were pelted with filth, rotten food, mud, animal dung, and stones. They were subjected to a relentless barrage of insults, their deepest shames shouted for all to hear. An even more grotesque device, reserved almost exclusively for women, was the scold's bridle, or brank. This was an iron cage fitted over the head with a metal plate, often spiked, that was forced into the mouth to hold down the tongue. It made speech impossible, inflicting pain and humiliation in one horrific package. A woman could be paraded through the streets wearing this device, a walking symbol of what happened when a woman dared to have a voice. These punishments were designed to strip a woman of her dignity, to erase her identity and replace it with that of a public spectacle, a cautionary tale made of flesh and bone. The physical wounds from the stocks, the bruises from thrown rocks, the sores from the rough wood would eventually heal, but the psychological wounds festered for a lifetime. The true purpose of these rituals was to inflict a scar on the soul, a brand of shame that could never be washed away. To be publicly shamed was to be socially annihilated. A woman's reputation was her most precious currency in a world that offered her few others. Once it was destroyed in the town square, she became a pariah. Neighbors who once shared bread with her would now cross the street to avoid her. Friends would shun her, and her own family would bear the stain of her disgrace. She would live in a state of internal exile, forever marked by the memory of 1,000 hostile eyes and the feeling of utter powerlessness. The terror of the accusation, the agony of the punishment, and the crushing weight of the aftermath created a trauma that echoed through generations. It was a clear and brutal message sent to all women: be silent, be compliant, be invisible, for the price of defiance was not just pain, but the complete and utter destruction of the self. The scars left by medieval medicine, scapegoating, and public shaming were not only borne by individuals, they were etched into the collective consciousness, a haunting legacy of fear and control that would shape the female experience for centuries to come. These practices reveal a past rife with fear, control, and suffering, especially for women. Yet by remembering these stories, we honor those who endured. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest corners.